again, it's the same conversation. We've got to calculate our dividends paid, which is what I just erased up here, beginning retained earnings minus all that. Our payout ratio is the net income divided by, or excuse me, dividends divided by net income. Which didn't change. Clawback is 1 minus that. Okay. And our ROA did change. ROA is net income divided by asset, and that did change because I netted these liabilities against it. And therefore the assets did change, and therefore our internal growth rate changed because the assets changed. Okay? Does that answer it? Other questions? Okay. What are we doing with Scala? We're practicing some linear regression. So all of this, okay, be reminded the first half, chapter 5, all of that was projecting financing needs given a sales forecast. So people who are presumably smarter than us gave us a sales forecast, and we take that and we project it. Okay? Well, now we've been promoted, so now we're up there, so now we got to develop the sales forecast. We talked about forecasting quite a bit. We will talk about it more in about a week or so when we get into investing, so we're not done with forecasting. But what we did here was just an introductory process of using linear regression primarily to forecast sales. Obviously, not the only way you can forecast sales. Okay? Obviously, like I've emphasized and will continue to emphasize, we're all trying to determine the best forecasting method. We're all trying to do that. Because that's a key advantage in your business. Regardless of whether you're a CFO forecasting sales or an investor forecasting stock prices, that's a key advantage. So in my opinion, if you have a sales forecast method that is very, very, very accurate, really about the last thing in the world you would do is share that with other people. You know? And that's kind of a, you know, I think that's a potential, if not actual, moral dilemma that you'll face as a CFO. Because when you're in a company actually making these decisions, okay, well, if you start sharing all those decisions and how you're making those decisions with the comptroller, for example, well, then they can get rid of you and bring the comptroller up, and he knows everything that you do, she or whatever. So, you know, I think you have an internal conflict, which is, you know, one of the reasons for your golden parachute arrangements. You know, because you've just taken your own proprietary methods that you've been working on for your entire career, and just in the course of what you're doing and having to back it up, you've given those to other people. And that's valuable. That's valuable. So now if they just get rid of you and then you go work for a competitor, well, they've got all your secrets. Plus, they know what you're doing over there. And that's not fair. Nanny, nanny, boo-boo. Okay? All right. So with that, this is just some practice using linear regression. Again, we're just assuming that sales are a function of time. It's a little hard talking about forecasting sales because it's going to be so specific to the company. You know, the price point and production and demand and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of, in my view, it's kind of hard to generalize forecasting sales. So, but we will do this different ways with stocks when we get there. So just for the practice of using the linear regression functions, we're assuming that sales is a function of, of time. Okay? So this is pretty straightforward. There are your sales for the last 5 years. Project your sales for 2010. I've done the same thing 2 different ways. I use trend, I don't know why, but I'll give you a third way. Recall that we have several functions that can do this. So using the forecast function. Yeah, me too. I'm not sure why I use trend. Maybe it's the book that used trend. I don't recall.
I just verified that I got the same answer.
Yeah, using the forecast, so the X is what we are trying to forecast. So in this case, we're forecasting sales for 2010. And we're going to set our model. Here's our known Y's. And there are our known X's. Okay, so those last two terms there are setting the model, and the first term is using that model to predict Y, as in the variable Y, not why you do it. Okay?
So you'll probably just ask the question, what are our sales for?
Yeah. Yeah, but, I mean, if I really wanted to be ugly, even though it's not that ugly for senior finance majors, the second way I've done more of the brute force method. So this is the same thing, except this is the actual equation for a line in here. Okay, so recall that this setting the model. Okay, so again, you've got your known Y's and known X's. So this is the slope of the model. This is the slope of the regression line. And this is the y-intercept. So this is the model right here. So a fair exam question is, what's the slope of the model? What's the y-intercept? So again, you guys should know that. You should know more than just how to operate the forecast function. You should know what that function's doing. And like I say, after quant tools and CAPM and all that stuff, you should know it. Okay. So, point being, 3 potential exam questions here. Forecast sales for 2010, calculate the slope of the function, calculate the y-intercept. And I mean, actually, if I wanted to go a step further, what's that?
I'm sorry.
R squared. And this isn't a great example of the use of R squared, but just for an Excel conversation, what's the function's R squared? No, and we're using levels rather than changes, and we're using years. This is not a great example of using R squared, but again, just from a forecasting Excel standpoint.
Correlation.
What's that?
Correlation?
We could throw correlation on there if you wanted to, but we haven't talked about correlation yet. We will talk about correlation in about a week. We will talk about correlation next week, but we haven't done it yet. Sure.
Is how the regression line fit the model?
Is what?
How the regression line fit the model?
Yes. Yeah, that's the goodness of fit. I want to know who came up with that name. Goodness of fit. Because in academics, we always try and come up with these really fancy, unique names so that we can leave a legacy to the finance literature. And in all of that, someone came up with goodness of fit. Well, if you ever figure that out, shoot me an email, right? Have you learned that in another class or something? Shoot me an email. Okay, so questions about this? Questions? Okay, and then the last one, which is, in my opinion, more important than this, is you're given the results of 3 forecasting methods, whatever those methods are. Okay, and this may be a little more realistic with what you would see. In fact, if I were doing it and I wanted to keep my proprietary information, this is what I would hand you. Okay? Rather than giving you all of my forecasting techniques, I would forecast them and then I would give you this and say, hey, 1, 2, 3, tell me which one's the best. Tell me which one is the most accurate. Because that way I can still delegate that work to you without giving away my proprietary secrets. Okay, so what you've got here is actual sales and then the forecast for each of these sales for each of these years using 3 different methods. And the question is, using mean absolute deviation, which one's more accurate? Using root mean squared error, which one's more accurate? And using the R-square method, which one's more accurate? Okay? And again, we're gonna do this again next week with investing. How do we calculate mean absolute deviation?
Actual minus
Forecast on the side.
We're going to take the differences between the actual and the forecasted and do what?
You square them.
No, for mean absolute deviation,
The absolute difference.
yeah, we're going to take the absolute value of that difference to get rid of the negatives.
And then the sum.
We will then add them up and divide by n to calculate the average. And that is what I have right here. So method 1, for example. Okay. Note your absolute value function. So C4, so this is the forecasted minus the actual. Right? Absolute value, which is that. So we're going to calculate that for each year. And then, bless you, sum it up and divide by n, which is to say, calculate the average. Hence the term mean absolute deviation.
For the exam, we would have to start from scratch, or would you have already had it constructed like this? Or-
Well, in a question like this, I would probably just give you this right here, and you got to go from there. But in a question like this, then I'm just giving you this. I'm not, this time around, I'm not going to make you actually do 3 different forecasting methods and then tell me which one. Next time around, on final maybe. But we'll see when we get there. Okay? Other questions so far? Okay, so we got our 3 different calculations. Which one is the best? What are we looking for? How do we interpret mean absolute deviation? Yeah, smaller, but just like standard deviation. Okay, it's a deviation. So the smaller that is, the more accurate it is. The less uncertainty there is. Poor choice of words, but the less variability there is. Okay, so we're looking for the smallest. So in this case, the answer would be the question is, which method is the most accurate? And the answer would be
2.
3. So answer choice A, method 1. Answer choice B, method 2. Answer choice C, method 3. Answer choice D, all of them are equally accurate. Answer choice E, cannot tell from the information given. Okay? So far so good?
Now I'm a little confused.
On what?
What am I looking at, the bottom numbers here on
Yes.
the, and what am I comparing them to?
Each other. Because what you've got here, you're trying to forecast sales. That's the point of this.
Right,
We're looking at 3 different methods that we've developed for forecasting sales.
Okay.
Maybe this one forecasts sales based on CPI. Maybe this one forecasts sales based on regional sales managers' estimates of sales. Maybe this one forecasts sales based on a guess, I mean, you know, whatever it is. Okay? And what we want to know is which one is the most accurate.
So I did.
So using this criteria, which is not the only criteria, but using this criteria, we make our calculations and we discover that this one has the least variability in terms of the difference in the forecast and the actual. Therefore, method 3 has been more accurate over this time period.
Okay.
Okay, Dolly?
Comparing the difference between the forecast and the actual.
Correct.
What?
Actual sales.
For 2009?
For all the years, for that 5-year period.
So we're looking at all the sales for all that time period?
Correct.
And comparing them to these methods? To what we get from these methods?
What?
The deviation from actual sales compared to the different methods.
Yeah, we've used these 3 methods to forecast sales for 5 years. The question is, which one has been the most accurate over that 5-year period? The answer is, based on mean absolute deviation, method 3 has been the most accurate.
I was comparing these together, that's what I was
No.
confused
No.
on, okay.
No.
That makes sense.
And then if we were to ask based on root mean squared,
Right,
okay.
which we'll get into in just a second.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
But
You're not
notice,
mathematic.
yeah, but notice in here that this is over this 5-year period. Okay? If we look back 10 years, then hopefully what we would find is that this would still be the most accurate. But if we found that over the last 10 years, this one was the most accurate, now we got a problem. We have a challenge. Because we need to figure out why. Because that immediately would lead me to believe that these methods were based on what type of relationship? Exam question. Now, I didn't say necessarily. What I said was, if we look back 10 years instead of just 5, and found that this one was more accurate than this one, then that indicates the possibility of what type of relationship?
Spurious?
Outstanding. A spurious relationship. What we would hope is that they would both be this accurate. Okay? And then, so that was 10 years. So then, if we look at these methods for the first 5 years, and the next 5 years, we would hope that in both of these sub-periods, method 3 was the most accurate. And then if we went back 15 years, and so forth and so on. That's what we do in academics. I'm sure it goes on in practice as well. You know, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of specifics there. But this is primarily what we do in academics. Okay? To determine if there's a relationship between this and this. And what we're looking for is a reliable relationship as opposed to a spurious relationship. So if I could show you, hey, over this 15-year period, there was a relationship between actual and method 3. And then I cut it up into half and say, hey, even over this period and over this period, over both of those periods, there was a relationship between method 3 and actual. And then I continue cutting it up further, and that relationship still holds. That's what we do in academics, is argue that is evidence that there is actually a non-spurious relationship. And that's what you would want to do in real life as well.
You would find that it's a non-spurious relationship when you cut it between different periods?
Well, we would argue that. We would argue that, because remember, really what it's going to boil down to is what's causing the relationship. Okay? And that's a much trickier question. That's huge. I mean, that's a huge conversation right there. Because if you think about it, I'm sure I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again. If you think about it, probably pretty much everything that you did in finance is based on a forecast. That's huge. In my opinion, the single most important calculation we make in finance is, see if any of you agree with me, single most important calculation, I'll tell the 34-3 cards. I'm not saying it's the only important one, I said probably the single most important. Net present value. Net present value. Well, what inputs do you need to calculate NPV? We need the amount of the future cash flow, we need the timing of the future cash flow, and we need the discount rate of the future cash flows. That means we need to be able to forecast the future cash flow. If we can't forecast them worth a darn, that's our problem in the stock market. If we can't forecast them worth a darn, then our NPV calculation isn't worth a darn. So, my view of the world, this is hugely important, if not all important. If our mean absolute deviation was 0, if, off topic a little bit, but in my opinion, hugely important for graduating finance majors to understand, if you were forecasting a stock, the very first stock that I ever looked at was Disney, just because I grew up here. So when I first became interested in the stock market, I was going to figure out what made Disney go up and down every day. Just for the sake of conversation, you'll never be able to do this, by the way. Just for the sake of conversation, let's say that I had continued working on that over the years, and now I could forecast Disney's price movements, Disney stock's price movement, with 100% accuracy. You'll never do that. But let's, for the sake of conversation, let's say that I could do that. What would I have? When I invest in IBM based on that, what would that return be called to me? Kind of a tricky way to say it, but I'm leading up to a point here. That would be a risk-free rate. Out in the world, they'll refer to that as a money pump. But that would be a risk-free rate of return to me, which would be in the 20% probably. That's forecasting. Okay? In my opinion, that illustrates the importance of, if you can actually do that, you don't need any of this stuff. If you can actually do that, you don't need IGR and SGR and all this other stuff. You don't need any of that. You'd make more money than your grandkids could spend if you could actually do that. Okay? You'll never be able to do that. But what if you could get it to 90% accurate? What if you could get it to 80% accurate? Now we start getting into probability theory. Okay? And trading rules. This is what we're doing when we're trading. Everybody knows that no trading system makes money every single time. So now we got to start looking at our win-loss ratio. And all of this is based on forecasting. It's all based on forecasting. Which is why I say it's so important to actually go back and look at whether or not your forecasting techniques are any good. Because if they're not, okay, just because you made money on it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. You might have gotten lucky. And we all get lucky occasionally. In the 90s, we were all geniuses in the 90s. Why? Because the market was like this. We all had great forecasting techniques. No, we didn't. We were lucky. What I'm trying to get across to the Young Investors Club right now is that just by function of their age, since they've been interested in investing, really the only market they've seen is one like that, which is much different than back in the 90s, which was like that, which was much different than isolating 2008, I believe it was, which was like that. And that's forecasting, whether we're forecasting sales, stock prices, whatever. Okay. So, with that bit of motivation, Dolly already alluded to it. Root mean square error is another way that we can making this determination, we're essentially doing the same thing, except instead of taking the absolute value, we're going to square the difference. Square the difference to get rid of the negatives. Okay. Still looking for the lowest. And in this case, it is method 3. Don't be fooled into thinking that they will always be the same, because they won't always be the same. I think in every example you've seen so far, they have been. That's not necessarily the case. So don't get automatic on the exam, unless there's only like 30 seconds left. If there's 30 seconds left, take a shot at it. Okay? And then the last one is using R squared. Noticing that what I'm using here are the percentage changes. That was part of what I was trying to get across to you earlier. I'll really emphasize this in the investing section. But R squared is much more informative when we use percentage changes than when we use the levels, the price levels. Okay, remember I showed you that last time with the time series properties, the permanent and temporary components. Okay, so notice first that I computed percentage changes. When we do that, unfortunately, we lose an observation, which in the case we only had 5 in the first place, so that's actually a big deal. We're losing 20% of our observations. Okay, but given what we have here, it's the best we can do. Okay. And then our percentages are the forecasted percentage change. Okay, remember I showed you that on the in-class example. So that was last year's sales were 2015. The forecasted for this year is 229, which is a 7% forecasted increase in sales. Okay, so point being, with this method, you first have to convert everything to percentages and then observe your R squared, interpret your R squared. And in the case of R squared, what are we looking for?
Higher.
And in this case, it would lead us to method 1. Okay. All right, so that wraps up chapter 5 homework. Questions? Questions? Go ahead.
Can you do an example of regression line?
An example of what?
Regression line to determine the slope and the intercept?
I'm sorry, an example of what?
A regression line.
A regression line?
Yeah.
Yeah. A regression, well, okay, yeah.
I think it's from the previous one.
You're talking about a chart?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So if we want to throw in a scatter diagram, one of the little, because I have the cursor there, so you move it away from things, then you don't have to fight that. One of the things that really bugs me about technology in particular, and IT people in specific, is when they try and do my thinking for me. That really irritates me. You know, like changing passwords and stuff. Leave me alone. So. All right. So select our data over here. So in this case, our x values of here. Y. Actually, I might have gotten this backwards. So there are our observations. Add a trend line. And there you go. So that's the model, which we're not interested in really in the case of forecast. All we're interested in is the R squared, which is what this is right there. And be reminded that I have a short video showing you how to create a chart on there. So if that is what I just did, if that's a mystery to you, I've got about a 2 or 3 minute video showing you how to do that. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. If, using this line as an example, if all of our observations were exactly on that line, what would R squared be? 1. Because R squared fluctuates basically between 0 and 1. Basically. Did I see another hand?
Yeah, I'm getting a different R squared. I don't know why though.
You're doing something wrong. I don't know, I'm teasing, I'd have to look at it, but, like I said, I might have gotten the X's and Y's backwards, but we're not interested in the model, all we're interested in is in the R squared.
Not even.
Maybe it's is it slightly lower than that?
It's 0.88 for method one. I just opened.
I'd have to look at it and see, which I'll be happy to do if you like.
But you're comparing method one and method two, right?
No.
Yeah.
He's comparing one to
No,
like
this
sure.
is,
Right, right.
no, this is just analyzing method one. This is doing this right here. So the chart that I just did is illustrating what's in cell C30. That's what I just did.
Comparing method one to actual.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so that takes care of chapter 5. What we'll do tomorrow, chapter 6 probably won't take us too long because I'm not going to open up the options can of worms because again, that's not a prereq for this class, so we'll kick that can down into the third exam. So we'll go through the leverages and the break-even point on chapter 6 tomorrow, which shouldn't take long. I will entertain questions about any of my time value money spreadsheets that you have, and that gets us into the exam. Okay, so exam will be 6, 7, or